You're lucky he's here. Good morning, everyone. I'm Carol Fowler, a member of the Chats Committee. A couple of housekeeping items. If you would please turn off all electronic devices. And for your calendars, our next chats will be Tuesday, May 5th, 10 o'clock, featuring authors and fellow retirees, Maine Warden John Ford and Maine State Trooper Mark Nickerson. Watch for more information about this program in the newspaper and in your email newsletter from the library. We welcome all of you to Maine's Mystery Women Share Some Secrets. And we're delighted to have with us three of Maine's most popular resident mystery writers, Clark Flora, Dorothy Cannell, and Barbara Ross. Kate is an attorney and Maine native whose fascination with criminal tendencies began in the State Attorney General's office. From there, she turned to crime. She has written the Thea Kozak mysteries, police procedurals featuring Joe Burgess, the most recent of which is And Grant You Peace, winner of the 2013 Maine Literary Award for crime fiction. Her Edgar Award-nominated true crime work, Finding Amy, is optioned for a film. Her Death Dealer is a gripping true story in which Maine game wardens and search and rescue dogs were instrumental in solving the case. Dorothy Cannell, in the middle, yes, was born in England and moved to the U.S. as an adult. She authored 13 titles in the classic Ellie Haskell mystery series. Her first, The Thin Woman, was named by the Independent Mystery Booksellers Association as one of the 100 favorite mysteries of the 20th century. Dorothy's latest series is set in 1930s England, featuring Florence Norris, housekeeper for a family at their country home. The first is Murder at Mullings. The second, Death at Dovecote Hatch, will be released this July. I'm actually reading Murder at Mullings right now. Booth Bay Harbor resident Barbara Ross is author of the Maine Clam Bake mystery series. Clammed Up, I always laugh at her titles. Clammed Up was nominated for an Agatha Award for Best Contemporary Novel and for Reviewer's Choice Best Book Award for Amateur Sleuth. The book was a finalist for the Maine Literary Award for crime fiction. Boiled Over followed, and Muscled Out will be available later this month. Barbara is a co-editor, co-publisher at Level Best Books, which produces an annual anthology of crime and mystery stories by New England authors. In summer, Barbara writes on the front porch of her home, the former Seafarer Inn at the head of the harbor, where sights and sounds and smells of coastal Maine inspire her. Our speakers have with them books for sale, and will be pleased to autograph them for you after the program. The Maine Coast Bookshop will be happy to order any of the author's in-print titles. For those of you who order, our speakers also have book plates they can autograph that you can take with you and then affix to the books that you might purchase. The Chats is sponsored by the First Main Street Damascotta, a community bank chartered in the mid-1800s that serves customers at 16 locations along the coast. And now let's welcome our speakers.
So, thank you. We are a little bit incoherent this morning, I think, because nobody was actually named the moderator until about 5 minutes ago. But that usually doesn't stop us at all. One of the things that I like to say about crime writers is that we spend 90% of our time all by ourselves, living in our heads, sitting at our desks with our backs to the world, and then they let us out and they let us talk. It's a very dangerous business.
It is.
So I thought we'd start out by amplifying a little bit sort of what Carol said about what we do in the introduction. So Dorothy, Ellie Haskell for a very long time, and now Florence.
Yes, I found my series involving Ellie Haskell started with The Thin Woman. And I love writing humor, but I decided to take a break when I came to Maine. And I would go out on the beaches and see sea glass. And my feeling, I could hear my mother saying as I went to collect these pieces. And originally I was just picking up any piece of broken glass, but I got into what sea glass really is. But I could hear my mother say, why are you bending down, picking up this broken junk? But to me, sea glass is a metaphor for the fact that all of our lives break at some time. Parts of us seem to be lost forever. But then those broken shards come back as something beautiful because they teach us how to live. So that inspired me to write my book, Sea Glass Summer. And by the time I did that, I had come up with an idea to set a book in the early 1930s in England. And it just so happened that Downton Abbey has come out. So my publisher is saying, which is very nice of her, if you like Downton Abbey, you probably would like this book. So that's where I am now. And quite honestly, at my age, I'm just thrilled to have a job. I did one political protest and with my friend Joe Hess, and there we're standing with our placards in the Walmart parking lot, and people were bellowing out, "Get a job!" And I wanted to say, but I don't have to have a job. I'm a senior citizen. And then it occurred to me, okay, well, I guess I do have a job.
Barbara, the Clam series is not your first published work.
True.
But you had another novel, and if you could tell us a little bit about that one, and then how you came to do the Clammed Up series. Is that what the Maine Clam Bake series? Is that
Yes,
what
that's the official series name, the Maine Clam Bake series. So how I came to be writing, so I guess I'm the newest author here and the newest to Maine too, so that makes me the newbie on two fronts. And how I came to be writing the Maine Clam Bake series, as Kate says, I had written a book called The Death of an Ambitious Woman, which is a police procedural which takes place in a town very like Newton, Massachusetts, where I lived at the time. But I knew I wanted to write a series, and the reason I knew I wanted to write a series was because I love to read series. I think the best thing in the world is when you find a series at like the 6th or 7th book, and you're like, oh, this is wonderful, now I have 6 of these to go back and read. I just love that. And I love when a series, like in Ruth Rendell's Westford series, where a town, she takes this town and it changes over 50 years from this little market town to this big dense suburb. So I absolutely love series, and I knew I wanted to write one. So I had was talking with my agent, and he was like throwing out ideas that he thought he could sell. And the first one was Nantucket Cookie and Fudge Company. And I was like, well, I cannot afford to do research on Nantucket, and I cannot afford to do research on cookies and fudge. So that's out. And his second idea was Block Island bicycle rental. And I was like, there's like 50 people on Block Island during the winter. How many of them can I actually kill? I don't think that has long series written all over it. And the third one, he said one word. He said clam bake. And my friend, author Lee Wade, who's here in the audience and who lives here in Edgecombe, had mentioned to me in passing, I mean I think literally in passing, that her daughter had gotten married on an island in Boothbay Harbor, the Cabbage Island Clam Bake. And I was like, that's it. Because, you know, I had been living, I'll tell that story, but we had this house in Boothbay, and for a long time as a mystery writer, I had been thinking, well, I have to make use of this location. So when he said clam bake, I said, that's it. And that's how the Maine Clam Bake series started.
It's, I think, rather fascinating if you sort of follow the trail, you know. You move somewhere, someone says something very casually, or something happens and you're drawn into a different kind of thing. So I started out writing what I always say, in the Nancy Drew tradition of, writing a strong amateur female PI who would save herself, who didn't need the strong, brawny guy to come bouncing out of the closet and save her. She saved herself. She saved other people. And I loved it. And then, as happens rather frequently in our business, the series got dropped by the publisher, even though people love Thea. And I looked around for what to write next and realized that I was spending all this time with the cops. So why not try and write a police procedural series? I love police procedural mysteries. I wanted to set it in Maine because Portland is such a small town, big city mix. And that led me down a very peculiar train of circumstances which led me to be writing true crime, which I never in my lifetime would have expected. And that, Finding Amy came about simply because the guy who was my go-to person in the Portland Police Department, who was in charge of their investigation division, was the supervising officer, the supervising lieutenant on the Amy St. Laurent case, and said he wanted to write about it. And I, being his friend, said, I'll help, which became like a 2.5-year detour. And a lot of time sitting in the breathalyzer room at the Portland Police Department and so forth, and then led to the wardens, who then led me to the new one, Death Dealer, which is another mystery involving search dogs and hidden bodies and so forth, but it just happens to be real. So I don't think that, we said we would talk to you about secrets, and it may not be so much secrets as it is truths and surprises, the sorts of the things, like the sea glass. But I think it's always interesting. You've probably heard from a lot of authors, but we're going to do it to you again. We're going to talk about how it begins. Somebody casually mentions a clam bake company on a Maine island. How does something like that become a book?
That's a great question. And my immediate answer was with great difficulty. So how an idea becomes a book. I had this little notion of this clam bake, and one of the pressures, one of the things about it, and this is my first secret, I'm going to reveal my first secret now, was my agent thought he could sell this series as a cozy culinary series. So you may have seen these books, and you'll see mine. They have very colorful covers, and cozy means, in essence, I hate that it's defined by a negative, but it means no overt gore or sex or blood on the page. And culinary means there are recipes. So my first secret is that I don't cook if I can avoid it. And my proudest achievement in 40 years of marriage is that I have convinced my husband I should not be allowed to go to the grocery store. So that's my secret. So I have just told this agent I will be writing a cozy culinary series. The other issue was that, he's in New York and the publisher's in New York. And I'm thinking, have they ever been to a clam bake? Because it's the same meal every single time. I'm just not sure how many recipes I'm going to be able to come up with associated with this clam bake. So that led to the panic that led to the first book, Clammed Up, opening with a wedding at the clam bake. It wasn't actually that Lee had told me her daughter got married there, but I was more thinking, well, if the clam bake was in financial trouble and they had to do other kinds of events and business conferences, they'd have to serve other kind of food, and I got myself in this whole panic cycle. So that's how that story came about. It really just built from there.
Now, you can answer this question, or I will give you a fresh one.
Well, I will answer that one, because I've been sitting here thinking. With my new series, Dove Coat Hats, that really sprang that desire to write in the 30s. It could have been the 40s, but I didn't want to walk around the war. A dear friend of many of us in the writing business was Elizabeth Peters, whose real name is Barbara Mertz. And she had just such a broad sweep of reading enjoyment. Here's a woman with a PhD in Egyptology, and she said, I write froth, but I write damn good froth. So she and I shared this enthusiasm for books, 30s, 40s, 50s. And she started sending me 3-in-1 books. A friend of hers was a used bookseller. And I discovered all these wonderful writers. E.X. Ferrars is one, Susan Woods is another, but people that maybe are not talked about today. So that set the seed for wanting to write a book during that time. The other confession I have to make, well, this is my first confession. Well, actually, it's been a long time since I made my last confession.
How long has it been since your last?
I'm not going to tell you. Sloppy attendance, let's put it that way. Growing up, my father was a reader, my mother wasn't, but she used to get a magazine called Woman's Weekly, and there were a lot of serials in those books, and very often they involved the doctor, who was very wealthy and drove a Rolls Royce, and he fell often for this rather plain young woman. Well, I discovered a writer called Betty Neals. Have any of you read Betty Neals? She did hospital romances, and I found them usually at used book sales, but my agent Meg told a publishing house who was reprinting, Dorothy loves these books, so I have every Betty Neals there. And she writes well, it's a small genre. But it took me back to those Woman's Weekly stories of my mother, where the hero was always a decent but quiet and never told his feelings, and the young woman would be in some sort of difficulty, parents had died, and he would offer her marriage, but it would be in name only, because he knows she's not ready to love him. So I decided, okay, so you could hardly put this in this day and age, could you? Because you'd be thinking, hey, what's wrong with this guy? He could be perfectly right for somebody else, but possibly not a young woman. So that didn't enter into it at that time. So going back even further, my mother was a storyteller, and she told us just a brief anecdote about a brassy blonde who opened her door, front door, to see a woman on the step. Now we know that every bad woman is a brassy blonde. You have subtle silk, but that was the idea in those days. You had blonde hair and you were a tart. So this young tarty blonde woman opens the door, and there's a woman with 4 or 5 children surrounding her, and you know, they've got running noses and they're most unattractive. This woman says to the brassy blonde, "You're Miss Jones." "Yes, I am," defiantly spoken. "You've been carrying on with my husband." "Yes, I have," defiantly spoken. "And you want my husband?" "Yes, I do." "Then take what goes with him." My mother told me that story well over 50 years ago. And I thought, here we have a young woman, only she's not a brassy blonde. She's attractive, really sweet young woman, but married men keep going after her. And the vicar, because I'm also fond of books with vicars, he falls madly in love with her when she goes to Dovecote Hatch, where my series is, but says, recognizing that she's been traumatized and she's not ready, that for the time being it will be a marriage in name only. And it just gives me so much joy to write this. You could say trash.
The secrets just keep...
Okay, that's the secret. Find a trashy plot and have fun with it.
Golly, that makes me want to talk about an unpublished book of mine, which is, you know, I mean, we're here supposedly to talk to you about our current books so that you will dutifully buy them. But I have this book, as yet unpublished, which begins with, you know, a situation. And, you know, books just arise out of situations. This book begins with this woman who has sort of pulled herself up by her bootstraps. You know, she's an accountant, but she comes from what we would call a nothing family. And here in Maine, you know, I can tell you where in Union they all live. And, you know, so forth. And she's gotten herself an education, and she's built herself a career, and she hired an assistant who then becomes her fiance. And she wakes up one morning, and everything that she has is gone.
Oh, I like this.
Everything that she has built, her client accounts, her personal accounts, anything that she has of any value is gone. And there's a note clipped to the pillow by a potato chip bag clip that says, "Thanks for everything," and the guy is gone.
And this isn't published?
This is not published.
Is it ever going to be published?
Well, I think that, you know, I may have to just take it in hand and publish it myself. But
so
the book opens with this is the backstory, and she's sitting beside the road. The police don't believe that she's not in cahoots with the bad guy. But they thinks that he's taken the stuff, and she'll sort of wrap up and then go meet him somewhere. And in fact, she's completely destroyed. And then the police talk about arresting her for embezzling her client's funds, and she just gets in her car and starts to drive. And she just drives. She doesn't know where she's going. She doesn't have a plan. She doesn't have any idea what's going on. She finds herself parked on the roadside in some small Vermont town, and she falls asleep, and this police officer bangs on her window and says, "You can't sleep here, but, you know, the cafe is opening," and so she drives to town. She has no money. She has no nothing. She's completely exhausted. She's ruined. She goes in. She scrounges up enough money from the bottom of her purse to buy a cup of coffee. She goes to the ladies' room. She comes back, and there's a man sitting at the table, and he looks like the saddest person she's ever seen in her life, and he says, "Smile and pretend you're glad to see me." And that's chapter 1.
That is brilliant.
So, you know.
I definitely.
I want to do that. All you have to do is print 100 copies, and we will all read them.
Yep, that's right. And then you can all be my beta readers.
Yes.
And you can post great reviews.
Isn't that what happened with 50 Shades of Grey?
It could well be.
She posted it on, not that you have to get
You know,
it's
not that kind of a book.
but that could we contribute some interesting parts? It's not my area of expertise, but
Oh, we're not going into it. Please, can we not, for television, go to 50 Shades of Grey? I got 55 Shades of Grey outside.
That's true.
That's the best line of the day, I think.
So, gee, where do we want to go from here? That was just way
Want
too
to
much
talk a little bit about our Maine connections? I mean, you're a native. Dorothy and I arrived here quite differently at different times from elsewhere.
Yes.
So how did we sort of find ourselves to be Maine authors, I think?
Well, that's a good one, and I think that adding on to that is the second half of that question would be, how did we come to be Maine authors, and then what is the importance of Maine? I mean, like your beach class, I mean, like...
Well, I became a Maine author in a very real way when this person sitting beside me, Clark Flora, invited me to blog for Maine crime writers. I do not blog, I do not do any of this stuff. Fortunately, I married my husband so I could give up my secretarial job years ago and be a housewife. But over the years, he has become my valued personal assistant. In fact, every year he gets Employee of the Year. Which our friend Margaret Maron gives to her husband. Once a year they have a board meeting, and he's always named Employee of the Year. So Julian is my Employee of the Year. So when I supposedly am emailing people, it's that man at the back.
That's a secret.
That's
That's
yes,
a secret.
yes, yes.
And I sometimes forget that I'm not chatting with Julie.
Yes, but you always are. So Kate has put up my blogs for me ever since I came in, and I'm so appreciative. So that made me a Maine writer.
And that's interesting.
Oh, but what about the seances and all
Oh,
of that?
yes. Yes. I'm one of these people who really would like to believe in ghosts. Going back to our friend Barbara Elizabeth Peters, she wrote as Barbara Michael. She lived in a house that she was told was haunted, but she was not a believer, although she wrote so brilliantly on this. In a little village, near the little village where we live, there is a spiritualistic community. And I did research one year for a book which may never be published by going to one of their seances. And it's enormous fun. And at the time, I'm sitting there and I'm believing every single thing. There was someone you loved, a man who loved gardens, is trying to reach you. That was my brother. But doesn't pretty much everyone have somebody who, but it was, the table did shift and jerk, and I know there's a logical explanation, but I went once with my friend Joan Hess, and she said, Dorothy, you are not going to be this gullible, are you? And I said, yes. Because I think, really, becoming a writer, to become a writer, you've got to be a very gullible person. Because who really thinks they can make a living?
That's another secret.
Another secret. So, in August, they have a month of seances and seminars. Didn't get to do it last year, but all my Maine writer friends are invited to come and spend 2 or 3 days, and you can stay at my house. You will have to talk to the man at the back about the rates.
Your sister.
Yes,
The employee of the year.
the employee of the year, because he's the one who likes to make money.
Oh, okay.
So possibly you should deal with me, but the wonderful thing about, and I'm harping on, I'm going to shut up now, is we live in this village where everybody knows everything about you. We have a very dear neighbor who's a little bit tactless, but I love her for that because it makes wonderful dialogue if you just shift it a bit. And she came bustling up to a fellow neighbor at a potluck and said, Martha, I've heard the wonderful news about you and Carl. I'm so thrilled for you. Congratulations. And Martha says, what? And this person says, that you're both on diets. And I thought, this really is Miss Marple's village. A friend of mine said that those Brits who crave to go back to England, she said, not our England. We just want that village living next door to Miss Marple.
Yes.
And in a way, Maine, and I'm going to shut up, Maine is that wonderful combination of England and the States. And I finally come home. It's wonderful. And that's it. I sit back and shut up.
That's fascinating. So first of all, I'm feeling really terrible about the whole employee of the year thing. Because my path is sort of just the opposite. So I was a chief operating officer of 2 educational software companies. And as such, I was there. I used to call myself actually the Miss Marple of the educational technology industry because it's a very strong, small industry like a village, and I knew where all the bodies were buried. But because I was the chief operating officer, when something would go wrong with my technology, 5 guys would come running in my office as if it was like a code blue in a hospital and, you know, start turning things upside down and say, you know, you probably don't want to see this, and do things to my technology. So since I've been home writing, my husband has also taken over that role. But instead of being grateful like you, all I do is complain. Oh my God, the service is terrible here, and I actually have to sleep with this guy to get the low level of support that I'm getting. So
I can offer you health benefits. But you would have to be junior to the man in the back. You have potential.
Could I qualify for employee of the year? Would
Would
I ever get a chance to be
You would be definitely in contention.
Oh.
And I could use that as a threat over his head.
right, so now I'm feeling
Health benefits?
really terrible, and because of the aforementioned no cooking thing, my husband also develops all the recipes that are in the book, which are delicious, and you would be very well. You would do well to try them, and
you have not.
Be grateful that I didn't. Do
You
them.
have not named this man employee.
I mean, I did.
This is distressing.
2015
Big time
could be his year.
I can see an employee relations memo coming out.
I think so. I'm feeling very grateful. So, but Maine.
That's the object here, to make other people feel rotten.
So Maine, my mother-in-law in 1989 went up to Bar Harbor and drove back down the coast with a girlfriend. And if you knew these two, you would know that they stopped at every antique store, gift shop, etc. along the way, and it got very late. So they decided they had to spend the night instead of going back to Massachusetts where they lived. And they pulled into a little bed and breakfast in Boothbay Harbor at the head of the harbor and spent the night. And the next morning they got up and they were in the dining room having breakfast, and the man who owned it was lamenting the fact that he had to sell it. And my mother-in-law, who had never said a word to any of us about having any interest in the hospitality industry, said, "I'll buy it." And she did, just like that, literally just like that. A few years ago, about a decade ago now, as she got into her late 70s, early 80s, you know, making 10 beds a day starts to be not really funny at that point in life, and getting up and making breakfast for a dozen people. So the economics of the whole thing started to go sideways. And my husband and I bought the house from her in a very complex transaction I like to call momatrage. Perhaps some of you are familiar with momatrage. And she actually lives now in the first floor of our family house in Somerville, Massachusetts, and comes up here for the summer. So at that point, we own this big house on the coast of Maine, and we are not going to run it as bed and breakfast because I am not a morning person, and I do not want to see strangers at my breakfast table. And I have said I would be happy to run a bed and get your own damn breakfast. There's not a market for that, unfortunately. So we have this big house, and now I'm thinking, well, what are we going to do with it? So really, writing the clam bake series was sort of my answer to that problem of what I could do sitting on the front porch and enjoying this house that I definitely wasn't going to have strangers sleeping in. And I said that I wrote a proposal to sell this series, but actually the series didn't sell. It wasn't pre-sold. The agent took the proposal around to many publishing companies. And the ones who rejected it sort of uniformly said, it's too regional. We don't think people will be interested. And finally, when the company that does publish them, Kensington, bought it and brought it out, I was so gratified to see that the largest place that it sold was in the place that the Nielsen ratings for books calls the combined area, which means any place too small to have its own Barnes & Noble. So the place it sells the hottest is in the place nobody thought it would sell. And we've often talked about that, and I think there's a Maine of the imagination. You know, it's not the real Maine that all of us have to live in that has problems related to poverty and problems related to drugs and problems related to snow. It's an imaginary, wonderful Maine. And I think that a lot of people all around the country carry that Maine in their imaginations, and they like to come and visit it. So it's been very gratifying to me that Maine has actually proved to be a positive and not a negative with these books.
So I feel like I sound the dark note. My colleagues are extremely funny and witty and wonderful, and here I am writing the dark side of Maine. And I years ago, when I gave my mother was a writer. My mother was a newspaper writer and a country living writer, and in her 80s she published her first mystery. So I always hold her up as the role model for, you don't have to give up on your dream. But we lived in Union. We lived in a small town. And when I would drive from my house down to the village, or down to the common, as we called it, you knew the story of every house. You knew the story of the people who lived there, and in particular what you knew were their dark secrets. And when I gave Mom's papers to the Maine Women Writers Collection, I gave a talk, and the talk was really about how living in a small town and knowing people's stories is the sort of genesis for crime writing. It's the genesis for knowing that, at least when I was growing up, and society was a great deal more censorious, and people did get whispered about, that those dark secrets and the lengths that people were willing to go to keep secrets, to protect themselves, to protect the family, and so forth, is a huge place to look for the origins of crime. Why do people do what they do? And the number of reasons that my police detectives can sort of say, what this crime either comes from, domestic stuff, anger, alcohol, drugs, greed. There's just a really small handful of things that actually are the sort of source for almost all the crime that we're going to be dealing with. And so I think that I grew up with this very deep wondering about what's that about. And wondering is what crime writers do. We start with an idea, we start with a piece of beach glass, we start with how am I going to use a clam bake company? And we begin to wonder, who might the story be about? And what might their problems be? And what are their issues? And where do they come from? And where will they take people? And so, I drive down the road and I'm always wondering, what's that about? Why is it? Or you go into a store and, who's the person behind you and who's the person in front of you? And why are some of the people out on the roads with us so intractably angry? And that wondering leads to stories. So that's, sort of my main roots, my curiosity.
So I find it interesting, both of you have that insider's view, whereas having arrived in Maine 10 short years ago,
well, that's what we came.
Yeah, I actually have that outsider's view, and my husband and I are both very much city mice. So his sister, who lives in Booth Bay full time, will say to her, well, how's that new restaurant? And she'll say, oh, you shouldn't eat there. He's terrible to his mother. And we're always like, yeah, but how's the food?
There is that feeling. The secrets that appeal to me are not the ones having to do with criminal activity in the past. It's the things that mean something very deeply to us, and it's hidden within us, and if it came out, we could be shunned, we could be regarded as an imposter. My mother, I mentioned her before about the sea glass, but she was a wonderful, wonderful storyteller. She gave the stories back to our great, great, great grandmother, oral history. And her grandmother, her maternal grandmother, became impregnated in the Highlands by the choir master, who had an incredibly beautiful voice. And I sort of picture what happening in the choir loft with, a flurry of So she was was sent to England, where people would not have to know of her dishonour. Married the man, but he was a ne'er-do-well and ended up going off to America several times and not appearing likely to return. He had a job as a tea taster, which is so wonderfully Victorian. But he went at the time of the Johnstown flood in Philadelphia, and supposedly he drowned in the flood. But his postcard to his family was dated the day after the flood. So did he choose to disappear? So he left a son, he left several children. And as I say, my mother was such a wonderful storyteller, and she said, this little child of about 8 said to his mother, "Mama," this was after the bailiffs came and took everything, "Mama, you will drive in your carriage again." When it's like something out of Dickens, isn't it? They came in, they took everything but her wedding ring. He did very well. He ended up working for the Indian Civil Service, put the family on its feet. But he had not gone to a, quote, good school, high school. He'd gone to a regular school. He had not gone to university. He went out to India and when asked where he went to school, which in England would be a public school, which is a private school as a boy, he gave the name of, we'll say, Cheltenham Gentlemen's Academy. And on one occasion, he bumped into a man who said, "You were at Cheltenham Centre. Don't you remember the old school song, 'Let's Sing It Together'?" And it came to me that to have that secret that you've lied all your life come out, to me would be a perfect motive for murder. My mother lied about her age. She was not 3 or 4 years off. And occasionally she'd say, "Well, of course, now I'm 61. And we would go to say, "Well, Mum, 64, kick under the table." I think my mother would have killed to protect her age. The fact that she had lied about it because she would be so hugely embarrassed.
Embarrassed, humiliated, yeah.
I think my first Thea Kozak mystery was based on a secret like
Yes,
that.
yes.
You know, so the child that's given up for adoption becomes searching for birth parents.
Yes.
And then the birth parents do not want to be found.
Yes.
And so there ensues, and the girl who's searching ends up dead, and the question is, what is her story? Because that was back when all the records were sealed, and
Yes.
you could not get at that, and it was a very difficult process. But it was a real issue. It was a real thing. So Carol is standing up.
That means something.
That it's now, we just take our cues from Carol. I just think if Carol were only, sort of like my business manager, I would make her employee.
We haven't really how we do this.
No, we haven't, but they may ask, because what Carol is standing up to tell us is that it is now their turn.
Yes.
So they get to wave their arms wildly about and ask questions. And if they don't ask questions, we'll sort of be like schoolmarmish.
Yes.
Well, you will ask questions, because I think they've opened up the door to many, many interesting things.
But we really need another 2.5 hours.
I'm wondering whether Kate and Barbara have a background in their families as storytellers the way Dorothy has.
Well, my mother was a writer, so of course.
But telling stories over the dinner table.
Well, my mother was only learned to drive when she moved to Maine and had this family and lived on a farm and was isolated and realized she needed to be able to take her kids to the doctor and stuff. So all of my childhood, she was terrified that, the 3 children would get out of control. And so when we were driving, she would tell stories. She would tell stories, or she would invent word games, or she would invent something that would involve a conversation about where we were. Name all the mountains. What river did we just cross? What are the names of the lakes? So very much, sort of her childhood, her family, growing up in the Adirondacks, and then locating us and attaching us to where we were. A tremendous sense of place. She was a wonderful sort of country living writer.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, my family are great readers. I have a lot of pictures of my family, my brother's family, my parents sitting on the beach, all of us, 10 of us with books on our laps. So great readers and great dinner table talkers. As a matter of fact, my younger brother contends that he couldn't get a word in edgewise until he was 12. So very verbally oriented people, but I don't have the sense of my family being storytellers. Although I was telling Lee just last night, the 4th book in the series, which is due June 1st, comes from a story my mother told me. So when Dorothy was talking, I very much was thinking, oh, yes. I won't say what it was, because it's kind of, you know.
What we should warn you about in the realm of secrets, before we go on with more questions, is that you may think when you encounter us that you've come to see us, but in fact we are always spying on you.
Yes, my research has always been eavesdropping. When I would take the children out for coffee or ice cream, they say, "Mom, you're staring." And I said, that's my job. Because there are stories all around us, little bits and pieces that we can pick up that are completely enchanting.
It's our job.
It's our job.
We can't
What
help
we do.
ourselves, right? Another question.
I'm interested in your relationship with your agents, particularly when you talk about developing a series and they're suggesting or trying to move you in certain directions. And I always think of writers as having, you know, not inspiration, ideas and things about what you're interested in, how that works. And you just mentioned you have a deadline, you know, what's it like to work to a deadline as opposed to just being able to write until you've got the story down?
So I think my story is fairly classic. My first book, The Death of an Ambitious Woman, was the book I had to write. It was the book that, you know, I just had to write. And I remember walking the little lane by our summer house, you know, kind of working it out in my head. And I did. So you need to get that book out, however you do it. And I wrote that entirely before it was finally sold. And, you know, the usual long, ugly story. I mean, I got an agent really easily, but she couldn't sell it. And then I went, you know, into a death spiral and put it in a drawer. I mean, like every writer, unfortunately, almost every writer's, 99% of writers' origin stories are, it was really, 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 really hard and terrible for a long time, and then something good happened. And then there's the one person in the crowd who's like, oh, I wrote it when I was on maternity leave and I won a big prize and I've been on the bestseller list. And honestly, you just really want to kill that person.
We hate that, yes.
But this was an agent who had approached Sisters in Crime, which is an organization we all belong with in New England, and said, I have some ideas I think I can sell. Does anyone want to write a spec proposal? And my first book had earned out, it had done respectively, so I kind of put together a little, you know, email and said, well, I think I'd be interested, and that's how we came to be having that conversation. So agents are, I've learned, agents will say things to you like when you send them their book, they'll say, I don't know anyone I can sell this to. And I used to hear, oh my God, there's no one on the face of the earth who will buy this book. But what they literally mean is there is no one in my personal Rolodex with whom I have a personal relationship who would buy this book. That's really what they're telling you. So they spend as much time working on the other side with the publishers and cultivating relationships and being the person the publisher calls when they are looking for something. Do you know anybody? So it really works actually both ways.
An agent story?
I wrote for 7 years without selling anything. And
10.
Okay, well maybe mine was 10. I'm just talking about what I
competitive.
Oh no, we're not competitive. Oh, that reminds me, I just finished a biography of Georgia Hare, whom I love, and I found out some things that were disappointing about her. One, that she really didn't like Americans, and which I kind of take personally. But she did not hobnob with other writers. And to me, and I'm forgetting what the question was, the great joy for myself, and I think for all of us, is lonely, lonely time writing, but then we get together and we can talk shop till our jaws drop down to our knees. I wrote for 7 years, not 10, I cannot lie, I can't say it was 10. But seriously, sending out a lot of short stories, finally wrote the book that became The Thin Woman, and sent it to several publishers. It came back, but I didn't get the form letter rejection, and I'd learned enough by then for them to say, we really like this, but it doesn't fit our list, which is, when they tell you that, that's a euphemism, but this is crap, and we're not interested.
All right, just don't love it enough.
Don't love it enough.
Which means you don't love it at all.
Yes. So finally I got out the writer's market, which is a dictionary, went through looking at agents, found one that said, we're looking for new authors who want to make a career of writing. And they gave the phone number. So I phoned, the young woman answered the phone, and I told her that I'd written this book, and I said, does it fit into a genre? And I said, well, no, I'm calling it a gothic frolic. And she said, well, if it doesn't fit into a genre, then you really have to be pretty brilliant to sell it, but send it in anyway. So she wrote back, and it took me on. And I thought, oh, this woman with no college degree is brilliant. Well, it turned out I was a genre fiction writer. I was a mystery writer. Didn't know it. And I have been with Meg, my agent, who's become a dear friend for over 30 years. And we will talk, and she will suggest, but she will always say, Dorothy, it's your decision, or whatever you want to do. Is that what you find?
Yes, yes. Because we live with this stuff for so long. You know, it takes a year to write a book. If you don't love it, you're going to be pretty miserable.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. Well, Georgia here managed to write and finish a book in 2 to 3 months.
I just don't understand.
I don't understand it, no.
4.5 is the shortest I've ever done, and that was, not ready for other eyes. I'm the woman in the agent world who's been married 4 times, and I despair of ever having a very good relationship. I had an agent that I got after the 10 years in the Unpublished Writers Corner. I saw an ad in Writer's Digest that said basically, literary agent looking for authors.
Yes.
And I said, yeah, right, phooey. I've got an entire, I had a thing going with myself where I, wasn't going to quit until I had enough rejection letters to pay for the bathroom. But the bathroom was small. So I was about to expand my sights when I saw this ad, and so I sent my stuff to this woman, and she called up and left a message on the machine, don't sign up with anybody else until we get a chance to talk. And later on I met her, and it turned out that she had gotten 2,000 responses to this ad. And of those, and then there she's sitting, with 2,000 things to read through, and she doesn't know what to do. So she calls up all her friends. She was actually a legal secretary in LA and had become an agent to sell her boss's book. She invited all her friends, bought them a mountain of food. Everybody got a stack of manuscripts, and they had a reading party. And at the end of the reading party, there were 2 out of those 2,000 that she thought were worth following up on, and I was one of them. And we were together for a while, but she was very, very flaky and not at all businesslike, and she really wasn't able to advise me about a career. So then I got this really hotshot agent for this really hot book that was going to be my breakout book and career maker. And the book didn't break out, although the publisher wouldn't let me do things to promote it. It was very weird. And then he never liked anything else that I wrote. And he kept sitting there saying, I want you to write a big book. And I said to him, okay, I'm here to take direction. I need direction. So tell me what what I should do. And, oh dear, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to remember the names of the 2 authors. So he said, one of them is the guy who carried the books around in the trunk of his car and then became a big hit. What is his name?
Not British, I've heard some kind of.
John Grisham.
Oh, John Grisham.
So one of them was John Grisham, and the other was this very intellectual Canadian author who wrote the Deptford trilogy and things like that. And so I looked at him and I said, there is absolutely no way that I can figure out how I write a book that is on the same spectrum as those two writers. They're so far apart. But he just loved that one book and didn't want to do anything. So then I got Charlene Harris's agent. Charlene Harris is True Blood and that series, who was the best editor I've ever had, but he could never sell my book. And then I sold the next 5 books by myself, 5 or 6, I can't remember which. And then I now have an agent again. And she wants me to write a big book. So,
well, that's a lot better than people coming up to you and saying, and how are your little books doing? And I want to say, well, it's not the Beatrix Potter. I know what they're saying. Your subpar genre.
Your genre fiction. And
Your
when
genre
are you going to write a real book?
And when are you going to write a real book? Yes.
I think we have time for perhaps one more question, and then you will all have the opportunity, if you wish, to purchase books by our wonderful speakers, and you can probably chat with them more at that time. So do we have another question for our guests?
No? Golly, we've exhausted them all.
So I did want to say one thing though, which I didn't get to say, which is, so my books here are Clammed Up and Boiled Over, which are the first 2 books in my series about the island where they get the clam bakes. But I particularly wanted to come here today because the 3rd book, which is not yet available, but which you can order down the street, is called Muscled Out. And in Muscled Out, my sleuth does take a little trip down Main Street and drive down to Round Pond. So that was why I particularly wanted to this is the first sort of time they've let me out of the house this spring, so I particularly wanted to be here.
Kate calls it book jail.
Book jail.
Yeah.
When-
I thought that was Lee's term.
We have all been in book jail, and there's no way to go around the board and pass, go and get the 200.
Oh, no.
No, you just
can't
you
get out of
stay in
jail.
book jail. This is when somebody asked about deadlines.
Yes.
So you're in book jail until June
1st.
I'm in book jail until July 1st. So
I'm
you're out of jail?
I should be in jail, but I'm writing 2 short stories, and then I'm just going to turn myself in.
Yes, flagging down, passing police officers.
Yes, at least we want a cell to ourselves, and we don't care if you keep us in here 23 out of 24, and don't let us have a television, and do not let us have anything to read, and please God forbid visitors.
It sounds perfect.
Doesn't it sound wonderful? Of course, we don't want to have to go in with a pen and paper. We need our...
No, we do need a word
Technology.
processor. And we'd really just like a little screen around that toilet sink combination. And we're fine with jail.
Let me ask a procedural question.
Sure.
Would you rather sit where you are and have the audience go and choose what books they'd like to purchase and come to you?
Well, first of all, I'd like to find my handbag, which I may have left
Is that it?
at the...
I think it's underneath the table.
I don't know.